have to make. And in particular, I look forward to these conversations to help me make more informed decisions. So welcome to this evening's open house. Every month we come together to think out loud, to examine issues of importance to us as a community and commonwealth. And tonight's look is at the wealth and income inequality. I have to say that the current challenges that we face with regard to wealth and income inequality, I think is an existential threat to democracy. I do not think democracy survives the divide and the growing divide that we have amongst our own people. And I think the combination of that threat and the role that money plays in politics is completely fatal to democracy. It's not just toxic, it's fatal. I don't think we survive as a nation, as a democratic nation, unless we attack and seriously attack and defeat those two serious challenges that we face. Happily, there's some great soldiers on our side of this fight. I knew of Chuck Collins before I knew Chuck Collins. He was the voice of United for a Fair Economy when I first started serving in the legislature, and had a reputation as one of the most passionate and informed spokespeople for social and economic justice, and activists for social and economic justice. And I actually didn't know his own personal story until I read Born on Third Base, which I heartily recommend to you, and there are copies at the table for you on the way out. So I think we're very privileged to have Chuck fighting this battle, and I'm particularly privileged to have him as a colleague and friend and as a guest for this evening. So let me turn quickly to make sure you get to introduce yourself to this audience. Tell us a little bit about your personal journey and then the fight that you're engaged in for social and economic justice.
Well, thanks, Jay, and thanks for your steady role leadership in the Commonwealth and here. I'm here with my wife, Mary. We live in Jamaica Plain, across the traffic flow from all of you, and we are empty nesters as of this fall, so we have more time to do things like go to forums in Lexington. But I grew up in the Midwest. I'm the great-grandson of the meatpacker Oscar Mayer. So my dad used to say, bringing home the bacon meant something different in our family. And so I approached these issues of inequality for a number of reasons. One is I actually have that front row seat to how over the last 30 years, wealth has kind of multiplied, assets have multiplied in my own family and my own community where I grew up in suburban Detroit. But in my mid-20s, my first real job was I worked with mobile home park residents around New England who were trying to buy their mobile home parks and own them as resident-owned cooperatives. So I also had this intimate front row experience of working with people whose real wages were starting to go down, whose livelihoods were starting to stagnate, and they were working more hours, taking on debt, just trying to survive. So when people talked about inequality, for me it sort of had a very personal experience. And so as Jay said, I almost 30 years ago helped start a group called United for a Fair Economy to do education on inequality. For the last 10 years, I've worked at the Institute for Policy Studies, directing what we call the Program on Inequality and the Common Good. And I co-edited a website called inequality.org, which is kind of a portal for data and commentary and things that we can do to reverse these inequalities. And the other thing, just coming from a privileged background, I also didn't necessarily tell my story that often, but I started to talk about it because I wanted people to know that, there are people who were born on third base, who don't believe they hit a triple, didn't get there on their own, and that we're part of, we can play an important role in kind of explaining how these inequalities actually undermine the quality of life, democracy for everyone, including people at the top. I think that's, we understand how it affects people in the middle and the bottom, but I actually think it really, it's in no one's self-interest to have these inequalities moving the way they are. So part of it is I've helped organize a network, it's called the Patriotic Millionaires, which is high net worth individuals. And this week, we're very focused on the federal tax proposal that's going to be coming out next week, and which will be probably very highly skewed to benefiting people in the top 1%. So this is a group of 250 business leaders, individuals who are out publicly saying, these tax cuts are not in our long-term interest. So that's just a little background. And I think people know the picture of inequality today. Stagnant wages for the bottom half of households for almost 40 years. A growing concentration, most of the income and wealth gains of the last, since the economic meltdown, almost all the growth in wealth and income has gone not to the top 1%, but the top 1/10 of 1%. The higher up the economic ladder we go, the more concentrated the wealth is. So the Forbes 400 billionaires have as much wealth as the bottom 65% of households combined. That statistic hasn't been published yet, but it's coming out in a report on Monday. And that is part because the ranks of underwater nation keep rising, people with zero or negative net worth, which is now 20% of the population, 30% of African Americans, zero or negative wealth, 27% of Latinos. So that's the moment we're in. We're in a moment of extraordinary and extreme inequality that pretty much hasn't existed in this country for 100 years, since the first Gilded Age a century ago. And at that time, people like Representative Kaufman, as he said, people actually had a very rigorous debate about how these inequalities were a threat to this fragile self-governing republic that was, still finding its way, and worried that if there was so much concentration of wealth and power in so few hands that we would move toward a sort of hereditary aristocracy that we rejected in moving away from England. So anyway, so that's a little bit about me.
So we've been here before.
We have. None of us, I don't think, individually have been here before, though.
Well, having introduced Mary, let me also introduce Kathy, my first lady, and partner in, I was going to say partner in crime, and partner in anything but crime. And it's actually her sense of passion and compassion that move me even when I forget my own. So, thank you. Now that we've gotten the romance taken care of, questions, comments, your thoughts, what we can do, what we should do.
Well,
If you would stand up so that the cameras catch you.
Hi, my name's Carolyn Britton. I actually got a chart sent to me today, and it talked about, it was more information about the election of Donald Trump. And I've been sort of going back and forth with a lot of different people. And this chart showed how the people who call themselves the Bernie or Busters, where that group of like 10% of his group voted in those 5 swing states that Hillary Clinton lost and elected Donald Trump. And so, when I get together with my family, we talk a lot about, one, how we're going to get more African Americans out to the polls. I'm from Louisiana originally. I spent a lot of time there. So we talk a lot about getting more African Americans out to the polls. But I just wonder, how do you reach people who are voting Republican when they are so clearly voting against their own self-interest?
You as good a thought on this as any of us.
No, but I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, I think the election that we just lived through is the result of the polarization that I'm talking about, that a polarized economy creates a polarized politics, and it gives rise to both a progressive populism, so a sort of Bernie Sanders, let's focus on the impact of billionaires, but it also gives rise to a regressive populism, which, taps into that feeling of economic insecurity, but sort of deflects the anger onto new immigrants, people of color. It's sort of the history of anti-Semitism is essentially that, look at the disruption shift here. And, I think people sometimes say, oh, there are people who vote against their economic self-interest, but actually I think a lot of people there that voted for Trump voted for disruption. They felt that the status quo of 40 years of growing inequality under both, Republican, Democratic administrations, that in their mind, Hillary Clinton was the status quo candidate, and that they were looking for disruption in the same way that they might have thought of Bernie Sanders as a disruption to the status quo. So I think the key is speaking to the underlying wound, if you will, the grievance, the sense of betrayal. Half the population has not shared in the economic gains of the last 40 years. So I think there's a program and there's a way to connect with people about addressing those underlying conditions. Now, for instance, the tax cut proposal that's coming down the rails, it's being marketed as you're going to get $4,000 more, based on an extraordinary sort of magical formula. And it's once again, only 28% of the population is falling for this. Most people actually understand that this isn't going to be good for them. So I think we're starting to see the beginnings of an undercurrent that will shift us in a different direction. And yeah.
Well, my 81-year-old mother always asks, she's still grappling with, well, why is it very few African Americans fall for that okey doke? And so we're struggling with that as
Right.
we talk to our neighbors and all of that, and try to get them to be able to see past it.
Yeah.
It's a real struggle.
Well, part of it is you don't fall for the politics of deflection. I mean, that's something that's been used to deflect the white working class and the white vote to vote regressive populism. So I think that there's a good reason why people of color aren't falling for it. It's been used against them. People have maybe seen Arlie Hochschild's book, Strangers in the Land, which is, she was embedded with the Tea Party in Louisiana for 5 years. And one of the things that she took away from it was people who feel like they've been sort of standing in line waiting to get to the American dream, but the line is stalled out. And now they're being told, Barack Obama some people are cutting in line. People of color, new immigrants are cutting in line ahead of you, and you've worked hard and you're faithful and you may have served in the military and you've been waiting patiently for the American dream, but you don't like the idea that people are cutting in line. And then along comes a sort of Donald Trump, and he says, I see you out there. I'm going to do something about it. And so what's the lesson of that? Well, we actually do need to get the line going. These inequalities allow us to be divided and pitted against each other, creates the fertile soil for this kind of regressive populism. So we have to address that underlying. But we also have to say, hey, look, there's a lot of people of color who have been waiting in line, sometimes for centuries, to reach. And it's not just the white working class that's been left behind. There's a sort of, it's half the population.
Let me just also speak to the political failure. I mean, for the longest time, it's felt like the Republican Party has lost its soul, but the Democratic Party has lost its way. Democrats have not been speaking to these issues, not at all. And Hillary Clinton has many wonderful qualities and is one of the brightest people ever to run for office, but she failed completely at raising these kinds of issues and showing the kind of concern and compassion that we need somebody to show. And the party's been terrible. Stan?
Welcome to Lexington, Chuck.
Thank you.
Heard you at the General Assembly of the Unitarian Universalist Association, so you've heard my question already. I did promise you that I would get you to Lexington, maybe at Fallen Church. but there must have been telepathy at work here.
I beat you to it, right?
Thank you very much, Jay, for doing this, because it's, I'm not a commissioned salesman, but I've read the book. It's one of the most important books written recently about these issues, and I would recommend it to everyone else. But at that, you may recall, meeting, I did suggest, and this is a segue, good, two other books that I think people need to read is the revised edition of George Lakoff's book on messaging, because you could tell Clinton was going to lose because the messaging sucked. I'm sorry.
We're talking about Don't Think of an Elephant.
Don't think of an elephant. Yes, don't think of an elephant.
Don't read the original, read the revised, because the original one should have been edited down to about half its length.
Yes, yes.
So the revised one.
Don't buy that used copy.
Jay. Yes, and then second book, which is, and one of the most important things, I think, or many important things Lakoff says is, and if this isn't readily apparent, facts don't matter. It's how you speak. And if you start arguing the facts, you lose. Okay. So next thing, I
just want to make sure. Do you have a question for Chuck?
Well, okay, yes.
He's still working on it from the General Assembly.
You talked about the importance in New Orleans of ballot initiatives.
Oh, yeah.
And we have one in November 2018, and we can roll out the vote. Progressives can get out the vote around those ballot initiatives. Okay.
So let me just, I cannot resist this, Dan.
Yeah.
Most of you know, Chuck, I think you know this too. I've had a countdown calendar on my iPhone for about 3 years.
How many hours and minutes is it?
Well, we're still in days, but just give me a second. Meanwhile, everybody else is thinking of the questions they want to ask. But the ballot question that Stan's referring to is the Fair Share Amendment to the Constitution. That will be on the ballot on November 6th, 2018. There are other initiatives that may be on the ballot if you sign up tonight for a $15 minimum wage and for paid family leave. Anyway, that election is 376 days from today, and we will have at least one and probably at least, hopefully 3 chances to address some of these wealth and income inequality issues that day. And I think we not only ought to be doing that because of the value and importance of each of those issues, but the symbolic value of that. And which actually brings me to a question I want to ask you about Occupy Wall Street. I would say that the DNA of this Fair Share Amendment to the Constitution begins with Occupy Wall Street. I think that created an opening for us, a vocabulary for us. It was not political in the way that we are now being political, but it was, to my way of thinking, a really important turning point, or will be regarded by history as a very important turning point in the public conversation. I don't know if you'd had thoughts along those lines or different thoughts.
I think that Occupy captured the gestalt of people's concerns about growing inequality that were bubbling up and unspoken. And the fact that, this notion of 99 to 1 or a focus on the 1% really was one of the things that emerged out of that. And both Jay and I worked in 1994, the last time there was a ballot initiative to address, to change the state constitution and have a graduated income tax. And I think I was the field director for TEAM in Suffolk County, a much younger person at the time. So I too am excited that we're going to have this conversation again, and I think the times have changed. First of all, I think people recognize much more that these inequalities are gripping the Commonwealth. We have one of the most unequal states in the country, and I think we can find a lot of people who will pay that tax, who will stand forward and say, this is not the end of the world. The sky will not fall if we have a 4% increase on incomes over $1 million and direct it to education and transportation. That actually, it's in the self-interest of everyone in the Commonwealth, and the fact that we don't have a graduated tax system is a problem. And I think we're going to be in a much better place, but we're still going to have to work really hard. And I was in Falmouth, Massachusetts last night. I said, invite me back in a year from now, and we're going to do a forum on these ballot initiatives, and how to talk to our neighbors about them. And this comes to Sam's point, which is it's true that you can tell people the facts about inequality, but if they have a powerful story that justifies inequality, they're not going to necessarily change their mind. And how do you change that? Well, part of it is to create counter stories and counter narratives. And one of the ones I found successful is finding people who, like some of the patriotic millionaires, who basically say, look, I could not have built this wealth without the public investments, opportunities, the fertile ground that made wealth possible. So I think demystifying that I did it alone story, and I don't owe anything to the rest of society, when in fact most people can look into their biographies and see, after World War II, debt-free education. Did anybody get access to a low interest mortgage through Veterans Administration or Farmers Home or FHA mortgage insurance? Did you benefit from public investments in infrastructure that opened up markets in a community or new technology? So I think part of our challenge is to disrupt the stories, the simplistic stories of I did it alone, I don't owe anything to anybody, and I would call it the myth of deservedness. And that is, people are where they are because that's where they belong, right? That they deserve to be there. If you're at the top, if you're in the 1% and you have this high income, it's because you deserve to be there. And if you're not there, if you're in the middle or at the bottom, that's where you deserve to be too. And that's frankly just a myth. It's a mythology. And part of working on something like this ballot question is an opportunity to engage neighbors, not just about the facts, but about the stories that they're holding in their heads. And that's why I wrote Born on Third Base, is to lift up the stories of people who see the web of public and community supports that make individual wealth possible. The Commonwealth, not just the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, but the commons, if you will, that makes it possible. And name those stories. And they're beautiful stories.
Great. Peter?
So let me pick up on the question of what the stories we have to fight with are, because I think there's another one other than the deservedness, individualist story, which actually has some of its origins in one of my heroes who lived here in Lexington, John Rawls. And John Rawls said the way and he meant this quite differently, but it hasn't turned out quite the way he meant it. He meant it, the question of a fair system is one that is the best for the least well off. But part of what that justifies is the argument, gee, a real entrepreneurial, open economy that lets people rise by their own abilities is going to end up being the best for the least well off. And I think that's one that carries an unfortunate degree of power. It shows up in the trickle down, but it shows up in a broader view that our economy really has made us the richest country in the world, and even the poorest come out okay. And I think that's a hard one to answer, and I'd love some help.
That's good. One of the important self-identity stories we have is that we have social mobility. That if somebody works hard, they can apply themselves and move up the economic ladder. And there have, I think after World War II, 1945 to 1975, that was more true. But the reality now is our social mobility arteries have hardened to the point where if you're not born wealthy and you want the American dream, and let's define that, the American dream of, owning a house, being able to take a paid vacation, being able to retire before you die, leave something for your children, have access to health care. If you want that American dream and you're not born wealthy, you are better off living in Canada that now has 3 times the social mobility. So the American dream moved to Canada. And I think part of it is generationally, people think, particularly people who are over 50, we think, okay, the story has changed. But talk to younger people today, talk to millennials, and they will give you a very, very different picture of a very different kind of economy. So that's one thing, is just to say, really, look at what's happening. Looking what's happening to the younger generation. that's one of the, I think, counter narratives that sort of breaks through as well. And thank you for invoking John Rawls here in Lexington.
There you go.
Hi. So I'd just like to kind of go back to a couple of earlier things that you said. One about the kind of role of the veterans' benefits after World War II, and also earlier in terms of the Trump campaign really being a regressive populist campaign. But I think in both of those cases, what we see is the role of racism, in that the regressive politics really pit white people, took advantage of white people's racism and other kinds of isms, religious intolerance, anti-LGBTQ feeling, and so on and so forth. And just systemically and structurally, so did the veterans' benefits after World War II. Those were denied to black people who served.
Yeah.
And so I think that we can't kind of underestimate the role that racism and other isms play in our income inequality that we have in our country today. And so I'm wondering kind of how you would see kind of addressing both of those issues, because they are one in many ways.
Yeah. Great question. About a year and a half ago, I spoke to the Retired Men's Club of Norwood, Massachusetts. 175 men, all European heritage, World War II, Korean War veterans. And it was this amazing opportunity, and they invited me to come talk about inequality. And I said, I'm just inspired. How many of you got a debt-free college education after World War II? 3/4 of the men in the room raised their hand. I said, how many of you got help buying your first home with a government mortgage, VA, farmer's home? 3/4 of the men in the room raised their hand. One guy said, yeah, I got a 40-year, 1% fixed rate VA mortgage. It's totally the ticket for me to get on the wealth building train. And I think that's part of understanding the sort of hidden history. I said, how many of you are helping your kids now make it in today's economy? And everybody raised their hand. They're like, yeah, we're all helping our kids because they can't do it on their own. One guy says, yeah, we're the parental down payment assistance program. We got help. We got a subsidized mortgage, and now we're turning around and based on the equity in our home, we're able to help our kids get into the market. But there would be no other way that they would have gotten into the market in the Boston area, right? So we talked about just what you're asking, okay, so we helped a segment of the population but the GI Bill, while it wasn't in statute racially discriminatory, it was applied in such a way that most veterans of color, Black, Latino, and First Nations veterans did not have access. There are a few notable exceptions, like Harry Belafonte and Sidney Poitier actually got the GI Bill and were able to go to acting school. But that wasn't the norm. And there's a really interesting film out, by the way, called Mudbound that's coming out this month about a black GI returning to Jim Crow South and the experience and the lack of, the opportunities there and what life was like. And that was the reality. And then mortgage lending was overtly discriminatory. So basically we launched millions of white households on the express train to wealth building, and we left behind people of color standing at the station. The train never showed up. So that, we just have to own up to that story, unpack if you want to look at the racial wealth divide today, why is it that, whites have the median wealth of white households is 13 times more than median African American household? It's because of that legacy of discrimination in wealth building, obviously not just after World War II, but going back further. So, but here's where it's politically gets interesting, because the stagnation of wages of the last 40 years has affected all wage earners, and it's led to that sense of betrayal and anger among white working class voters. So one way to think about it is there is the legacy of racism and wealth building, which is centuries old, and it's where the past shows up in the present in terms of what kind of equity people have, what kind of wealth they have. And then there's this recent phenomena, recent relatively, of inequalities that have compounded the racial wealth divide, supercharged it almost, but have also left behind a lot of other people. So I think the way is we have to have solutions, interventions that both address the massive percentage of people that have been left behind, but we also have to specifically address the legacy of racism and wealth building, and it, through access to first-time homebuyer programs, debt-free college education, some form of reparations and repair that deals with, because we'll never, as Ta-Nehisi Coates says, we will remain in a state of arrested development if we continue to believe that it's all about our own individual effort and that the past has no impact on the present. It says once we understand the past, the weight of the past on the present, then reparations is a natural response to that, in the same way that reparations for Japanese people who were interned during World War II, or post-World War II reparations in Germany. That when a society grapples with their past, then they're able to move forward. And if you don't grapple with the past, we're just going to stay stuck. So I think our friend Tom Shapiro at Brandeis proposes sort of a racial wealth equity audit of all the public policies we do. Will raising the minimum wage reduce the racial wealth disparity? It will, actually. Will debt-free college education, universal, reduce the racial wealth disparity? Maybe not. So we have to sort of audit each proposal specifically.
I'm writing down his name because we're going to invite him to come.
He has a new book out called Toxic Inequality. And he was one of the early researchers who looked at the racial wealth divide from Brandeis.
You can count on him being invited. Hopefully he'll come. Let me also just mention Maria Axner has her hand up, but I want to introduce her as one of the people in the Commonwealth who's coordinating what will be announced shortly as a Poor People's Campaign to begin on Mother's Day in 2018. Many of you who are involved in the Democracy Demands Engagement series in the spring have heard me talk about William Barber, Reverend William Barber. He was here in Boston just last week to help kick off what will be a major campaign to bring some focus to exactly this suite of issues. And race and income inequality and all the rest are inextricably linked. And I think your point about reparations and coming to terms with our past, he refers to race as this nation's original sin. And that's basically it.
Peter Diamond, no mention of something that I think is just huge in the political process, the urban-rural divide on attitudes to government and many other things.
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that, when we talk about real wages being stagnant for half the population, there are obviously these pockets of prosperity around where we're living here, and then there are sacrifice zones across the Midwest. I mean, I grew up in Detroit, so I've sort of watched that over decades. But northern Michigan, there are places where, communities have completely been left behind, and where that's, so those pockets, and then electorally, they show up as, red regions. We were talking, Jay mentioned candidate Hillary Clinton, but I think if the Democrats have been thinking about rural communities and rural economic development and talking about West Virginia and saying, look, okay, we need to make a transition to a post-coal economy. How do we do that in a way that doesn't make most of the sacrifice fall on one segment of workers in one geographic area? What would it look like to have a just, fair transition for workers in regions that need to transition, right? The coal country in Kentucky. And if progressive Democrats had a commitment to rural issues, addressing rural poverty, and not always just focused on sort of the urban base of the party, I think we would be in a very, very different place. And I think there is a program that would make a big difference in rural regions. I think cities are obviously huge engines of economic development, but they're becoming more and more, the quality of life in major metropolitan areas is declining. I think a lot of people would like to live in small towns and rural areas if there was economic opportunity. But we've essentially disinvested those regions. So.
All right.
I would like to shift the discussion about the solutions from what I've heard so far to something that might help a lot of people who are not educated and don't have a chance in the lifetime to go to the college and be very bright there. It's the entrepreneurship, encouraging entrepreneurship at a lower level of the income. Entrepreneurship does not necessarily require high education. It requires a lot of encouragement. There were programs in the past year where they said 5% of whatever you contract from government will go to minorities. But think on those lines. It did help a lot of people. So if we have a massive program that the lot of the money that government is spending on all kinds of programs, that it will 10% of that will create entrepreneurs in the area, rural areas, or in the places where people, Black Lives Matter, then we will see in a year or 2 or 5 years something coming out fast. Because entrepreneurship can be taught.
Yeah.
And opportunities can be created for them. So
Let's give Chuck a chance to react.
Well, I actually share your excitement about that as an important path. I think we're in an interesting phase of where there's growing monopolies in a lot of sectors of the economy, and it's very, very difficult to do kind of startups. Take beer. There's this exciting local craft brewery movement that's popped up. If you think about 50 years ago, there were 87 beer companies. Now there's 5,000. But there's a duopoly. These two giant beer companies control this whole sector, and they're now starting to push out all these startups. So one thing is we have to pay attention to monopoly and how that thwarts entrepreneurship. But I think you're right. There's all kinds of supports for startups. And one thing I would just point out is the Nordic countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, have higher rates of entrepreneurship per capita than the United States. Now, why is that? It's because as a country, they have a commitment to lifelong learning, lifelong retraining and education, but there's also a social safety net. And if you're an entrepreneur in this country, you want to take a risk, you often have to have a family, private safety net. But in those countries, the worst thing that's going to happen if your business goes belly up, if your brilliant entrepreneurial idea flops, is you get to go back and do some job retraining, and you don't become destitute, and your family doesn't become homeless. So I think having a strong floor, a social safety net, actually creates an environment where more people have the security and opportunity to pursue their entrepreneurial dreams, and it opens up opportunities. It doesn't just become a small segment of people who can afford to take a risk. So I would encourage that as another piece of creating a culture that encourages entrepreneurship.
Hello, Chuck, Jay, Brendan Moore here. The question would be, could you speak towards the upcoming changes that are going to be happening with technology, widespread, and how you see job loss and things of that nature?
Yeah, I think on top of these inequalities that we're living through, we're going to start to see more disruption from labor-saving technologies. Just if you think about what's one of the largest sectors of individual male employment, it's drivers. There's a very interesting, rigorous conversation going on about the idea of a guaranteed basic income or a universal basic income. It's actually, one of the sources of it is coming from Silicon Valley, where all these technology entrepreneurs are sitting around saying, we're designing all these tools to save labor, and we understand that's going to have a socially disruptive effect. And maybe as a society, we should come together and say, well, wealthy people have income from assets or income from investments. Maybe everybody should have a minimal basic income that would give a foundation of security. So there's a very interesting, rigorous discussion going on. It includes kind of libertarians, and the Charles Murrays of the world, who would like to dismantle sort of the welfare system as it's currently structured, but still want to support people and have a universal income, to people who think it should be a complement or a supplement to a web of other social supports. But that's one interesting response, is first of all just saying, look, the benefits of labor technology shouldn't just translate in more wealth going to the few, but those benefits should be spread around. More free time. Remember, that's the promise of technology, was always more leisure time to spend with the people you love, and in nature, and in community, and in the non-monetary economy. And that hasn't been the case. So maybe we should be saying, well, let's explore a universal basic income. And the province of Ontario is piloting an experiment with that. There's a couple of cities. Oakland, California has a pilot. So I think that's one of the things that we should be looking at in the face of technological disruption. Not all income has to necessarily be connected to work.
Actually, you answered my question. I was going to ask about universal income. My name is Fred Ezekiel. When you say inequality, there's always going to be inequality. It's the degree of inequality that counts.
Right, yeah.
When I came to this country, the tax rate for the rich was 70, 80%, and keeps going down. It seems to me the concentration of the wealth upstairs is really what's hurting. And again, technology, now we're not going to have people driving cars anymore. So we keep cutting labor and cutting labor. There will be labor that are going to make a lot of money, but an awful lot of people that are not going to have any jobs. So
I just want to make sure there's a question in there.
I'm sorry.
There is. I hear it.
Yeah, and I'm sorry.
I'm going to give Chuck a chance to respond.
I love comments myself. I can just nod and go, yes. No, but the point you're saying about the concentration at the top is the thing that I actually kind of animates me, because clearly we have to do things that raise the floor and level the playing field, including addressing money in politics and the distorting influence of money in our electoral system. So there's a whole bunch of things there, but I think we can raise the floor and level the playing field. But if this concentration of wealth and power remains in place, it will continue to undermine our efforts. And I actually chair a little working group called the Hidden Wealth Task Force, which is looking at where's all the money going. Because at the very, very top, there's a dynamic, which is I'm talking about households with $40 million and up now. It's now estimated that about a third of their wealth has vanished. It has either gone offshore into offshore accounts, or it's gone into kind of complicated trusts that mask who the beneficial owners are, and often case there's a interaction of those two. So about a third of the wealth of the very wealthy is now hidden from taxation, oversight, and measurement. So one implication is that the actual levels of inequality in the society now are actually greater than we're able to measure because of the huge amounts of wealth that are being hidden. So this sequestering of wealth at the top, and we used to think of most inequality being driven by differences in income. Now it's differences in capital income. Owning wealth now is creating the growth of more wealth. So we have to restore progressive income taxes. We have to defend the inheritance tax, the estate tax. It should only fall on very, very small number of households, 50 million and up. I mean, right now it's 11 million and up. The current proposal is to abolish it again. But actually we should go the other direction. We should defend the inheritance tax and close all the loopholes that make it possible for people to circumvent it. That's the only way I think, to get the republic back, to save, and that's hard because people, when you start talking about taxing the wealthy, you lose some folks. My favorite Bernie Sanders quote, you probably heard it, is he says, "Under the socialist presidency of Dwight Eisenhower, the wealthiest 1% paid 3 times higher income tax, 5 times more inheritance tax, and we invested it in public goods, infrastructure, education, housing." So that's his.
You did Bernie really well.
You listen to him a few times, right? Maybe like Larry David, we're genetically related in some way, but I don't know.
Maria? I'm trying to go to hands as I notice them, so. Yeah. Why don't you stand up there so the camera catches you?
I'm wondering what you think about what needs to happen with global capitalism, because that so much affects our country. A lot of the things you're talking about are what we can do locally, which is so important, locally or across the United States. And how do we even think about that?
Well, let's just all pause for a moment and think. No, we're living in a period of hyper-extractive capitalism. It's a flavor of capitalism that does not exist everywhere in the world. I think there are different regions that are sort of saying we want to defend ourselves against these, and when I say extractive, I mean extracting from nature, extracting from workers, extracting from communities, kind of the hoovering up of wealth that's going to a small number of asset owners and corporations. So I think our work does involve nailing down as much of the commons and commonwealth to protect it from that extraction. Look at the housing market. How much, look at protection of nature and natural resources, defending workers and having, again, a guaranteed family medical leave and things that protect. So this is more the theory, but the way, and then support those movements around the world. So support Via Campesina, the movement of farmers around the world who simply want the right to be able to grow food for people in their own community. So that's where, we can do things at the local level, but it's very important to be part of networks that look across the world, and how do we form people-to-people friendship movements to help support those efforts in other places. So, and support countries that are basically pushing back against that. So I think that's just one way, is to say we're moving to a next system. And there's a terrific little project called the Next System Project, and I have a monograph called at nextsystem.org/inequality is this piece that I did on reversing inequality, and it's essentially looking at how do we move to a system that has broader ownership, for instance. So what if more enterprises, more of the productive enterprises were more broadly owned by more workers and even communities? We're sort of stuck in the paradigm, look, we only have crazy extractive capitalism or, Russian gulag, sort of Stalinism, right? These are the two options. Which one do you want? And in fact, there are ways in which we can rewire capitalism. Maybe we don't even call it capitalism, but you rewire the system that has broader ownership, protects the commons, more broadly shares prosperity, more broadly shares ownership. And those elements are things that can be done at the local and state level.
Okay, I'm going to come around to you next. I'm just trying to go in the order in which I saw hands.
All right. Do I have to stand up?
Please do.
Oh, okay. Do you think that we're using the tax system as much as possible to make things better for people who are not so well off?
Au contraire.
Yeah.
That's something that I think is very, very important. But I also think that we need to pay more attention to the opportunities for education. College should be much more free and available for people who don't have the wherewithal, because without that, they are not going to be able to do as well as they might otherwise.
Yeah. This is one of those places where it's really important to lift up that Jay has served, on the Tax and Revenue Committee. It's not always the hottest, coolest, sexiest topic. I've got to think some of those hearings could be pretty challenging. But he's sort of watched the ball for 20 plus years on tax policy in the Commonwealth, trying to make it more fair and equitable. And I would just say on a big picture level, right now the tax system is kind of it does need radical reform. It's much more regressive than it should be. It's steadily getting more regressive at the federal level. If you think about this idea of taxing the bads, sin taxes, right? The whole idea like, okay, we're going to tax sodas, we're going to tax tobacco, we're going to try to change behavior. Those end up being regressive taxes. What if the bads were environmental destruction, extreme inequalities of wealth, and financial speculation? What if those were considered the bads, and our tax system was designed to discourage, reckless consumption that destroys nature? So you can imagine it's in the current debate, we're not even really able to envision what would a tax system that really reflects the future values of where we want to go look like. But I think it's upside down right now. Even what we subsidize, let's say we want to help first, we spend as a society, I'm talking at the federal level, $600 billion a year to help people build wealth. Most of that $600 billion goes to the already have lots. The home mortgage interest deduction, these retirement funds, savings programs, those are good, but that's where most of that subsidy goes. What if we said, like after World War II, let's redirect that subsidy to people who've been excluded from wealth and opportunity, first-time home buyers, people who want to save a little bit of money so they can get into the economy. So our current tax system doesn't have enough of those supports, I guess.
As I make my way over here to the gentleman who was the first to arrive, so he certainly gets to ask a question. Let me recommend you Google Social Progress Index.
Oh, yeah.
It's a relatively new metric of our economic well-being. It's totally different than gross domestic product and all the rest. It measures things like wealth and income inequality, extraction of natural degradation of the environment. It measures us and other countries by a whole bunch of these measures that make a lot more sense and that are certainly a lot more of greater consequence long term. And if you look at the rankings of country, we don't look so good.
I strongly agree with that. Michael Medlock. I'm strongly in favor of universal health care, not necessarily single payer. And as far as this petition goes, I'm strongly in favor of paid leave and job protection for early child care. The Commonwealth tried to put a limit of 11 on the number of employees that required a health plan, and then they backed off to that to 50. The petition that's being circulated here has the same problem to my eye. There needs to be some kind of cap. So it's a specific question about how you set limits, and should we just dissociate healthcare and parental leave from employment altogether and make it something that is not tied to an employer?
I mean, ideally, that's the way the system should go. It should be delinked from employment, just like income maybe should be partially delinked from employment. And I would leave Jay to answer if you had a more specific response. By the way, Mary and I helped coordinate something called the Jamaica Plain Forum, which is very similar to this. And we just had our former state representative John McDonough, who was our state representative. You probably overlapped with him for a little while.
I served with him, yes.
Then he went to, work at the state level on our healthcare plan. Then he worked on the Affordable Care Act. He came back and basically gave kind of his retrospective reflection on it. But he basically said, yeah, we have to figure out ways like the British system and other systems to delink from employment as the.
Yeah, I would sort of underscore that point. John and I actually disagreed about this. At the time that we did the so-called universal health care in 2006, I gave it a C minus. And a C minus is better than the F that we had before, but it's only a C minus. And it was because we did absolutely nothing about cost containment. And we had things like 1150, whatever the number of employees is concerned. We were not yet delinking employment and healthcare. So we're the only nation in the world that does it this way. We do it this way for historical reasons. At a time after World War II, there was no way to, well, actually during World War II, there was no way to increase wages, so we gave away health care. Employers gave away health care as a way of keeping employees happy. That was at a time when there was no other way to keep employees happy, and health care didn't cost very much. The world has changed a bit, and that we just need to completely separate those two. I don't know what it's going to take to have us have that conversation, other than the total collapse of our current system. And we may well be approaching that at this point. So for those of us who like to look at the glass as half full, collapse may not be so bad, because we'll have to pick up the pieces and come up with something afterwards. My concern obviously is for the damage that gets done along the way. But I completely agree with you that they ought to be delinked. Did you want to? Let me just give you this for the...
Do you think that the family leave and paid family leaves as a social determinant of child health would fit into the same basket of
absolutely.
Being delinked from employment?
Absolutely. And again, if you look at the social progress index, a feeling of security within the family, within the community, matters a lot. And I don't think there are too many of us that would give us very high marks on that right now. And to the point Chuck was making earlier, you shouldn't have to risk homelessness to be entrepreneurial. And that's the way our system is rigged right now. And I think we know this. It's shocking to me. Chuck, I assume you agree with this. It's shocking to me that a Jewish socialist from Vermont came this close to being president, right? Because he was speaking a truth that we know. And he may not be the most effective salesperson of it, but he was pretty damn effective. And, but for some tweaks or some oddities in the system, he would have been the Democratic nominee, and he almost certainly would have beaten Trump. And I think it was the same. I think your point about populism on the left and right is exactly right. And the issues that he was bringing into focus are ones that resonate with us. I think half of us don't vote because we know that the choices we're given don't speak to who we are as a nation or to where we want to go. So I'm absolutely convinced that the politician who figures that out will be successful. And Bernie came damn close. Very close. Now, I think Trump exploited the same things, and God help us, is our president. There was one other hand over here that I saw, back here, and then I'm going to come back here, if we still have time, although I think we're rapidly running out.
I'd like to mention campaign finance reform. So the current system is one of the ways in which inequality becomes a threat to democracy.
Yeah.
So at the federal level, any kind of initiative seems to be dead. I'd love for somebody to tell me that I'm wrong. What about in Massachusetts? Does anybody know of any initiatives, or in your group of 250 millionaires? Did that topic ever come up?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of protect democracy reforms that need to be part of this program. Partisan gerrymandering, campaign finance reform, sort of the ways in which, just defending the right of people to vote in certain states. That's the front lines right now because of the way in which, the districts have been redrawn to limit competition. So we have fewer and fewer competitive districts. And even so, we've created the conditions for minority rule, if you will, by a small, kind of mostly right-wing segment of the population can, govern maintain electoral power even when they don't have a majority of vote. So that's clearly the the challenge of the 2018 election, defend the vote, push back against partisan gerrymandering, and lay the groundwork. And I think Maine just passed an interesting campaign. Maine has publicly financed elections. In addition to that, they just passed a sort of instant runoff voting system for state level races. So there are definitely reforms. Seattle just passed an interesting public financing provision where all the residents of Seattle get vouchers worth $250 that they can give to the candidates who are running for city office as a substitute for private money. So every voter gets these certificates. So there's a lot of more creative reforms that we could start to do that I think will then hopefully bubble up and affect our national campaign finance system, which is pretty locked up at the moment.
Let me the one-word answer to your question about whether anything's happening at the federal level is no. Nothing good anyway. And I think to Chuck's point, instant runoff voting, public financing of campaign, until we go those routes, we're struggling to offset some of the penalties that the current system leaves us with. We, the voters, actually voted for public financing of campaigns in Massachusetts. The Clean Elections campaign that we were both involved with was very successful and then was basically overruled by the legislature. It was never funded, and then it was just repealed. We may have to fight that battle again, and I do think we should. This is not making me very popular with my colleagues, but so be it. I don't think we get out of this conundrum until we figure out how to, back to your point about separation here. We need to separate money and politics in the country. It's not as bad here in Massachusetts as it is nationally, or for that matter, as it is in other states. There are limits to how much any individual can give. We can't, those of us who run for office can't accept any money from corporations, for example. So there are some safeguards built in here that have me not as nervous about the situation in Massachusetts as I might be. But even so, nationally we're in horrible shape. And unfortunately, we're also out of time now. So I would love to come back and take a look at the whole issue of connection between money and politics. We will come back and take a look at the ballot questions that will be before us in the fall. And we're going to keep needing Chuck doing what he does in order to help us continue to address the issues before us and actually have some hope and some vision for how we can move forward. And I just applaud you for the work that you do and for who you are. On the way out, I invite you to buy a copy of Born on Third Base. It is a great read. And I invite you to sign up for the 2 petitions that we are still trying to get on the ballot, the paid family leave and the $15 minimum wage. Next month, we're going to come back here on November 15th, if I remember correctly, November 16th, for what's called Your State Representative Looking Back, Looking Ahead. It's a chance for me to think out loud with you about the last 23 years and what lies ahead. So please come back. Thank you very much for being here. Chuck, again, thank you.
Great questions.
Mary, thank you for coming too.
Thank you all. Yeah.
Good night.